Hello and welcome to Conversations from the A&F podcast. In this episode, we speak to Nancy about her experience of entering the care system as a very little child, growing up in foster homes and ultimately working with children and families to promote the voice of children and create paths to healing for them. Nancy has lived a remarkable life, and in some parts this is a hard listen, but certainly thought-provoking. As always, if you have experience of adoption, fostering or special guardianship from any perspective, personal or professional, or would like to share that on the podcast, please do get in touch through our Facebook page, through Twitter, or you can email us at theanfpodcast@gmail.com.
My name is Nancy Maley at the moment. I'm professionally, I'm a therapeutic counsellor. For a lot of years, I've done attachment and trauma therapy with children and families within the care system and adoption. And that's one of my main passions. I did think I wanted to be a social worker when I first started out, but then when I did experience in residential care, I realised that there were too many ties stopping me from doing what I wanted to actually do, and too much red tape, and it would be too frustrating. So instead I decided to train to be able to sit on the carpet with the child and help them to gain change from within, rather than wait for other people to see and be able to facilitate what they needed. Sorry.
No, I was going to say, you said that's part of who you are. Tell me a bit the other half.
I have quite a few hats at the minute. I had a couple of years out recently because I've done that work for 20 odd years, even though I only look 17. So I had a couple of years out of trauma because obviously I've lived through trauma as well. So I was 2.5, I think, when I had my first foster placement, and 17 when I left foster care, in and out for a few years. And then did trauma therapy for a lot of years. And it kind of got to the point that my brain and body were saying, enough, you need a bit of a break now from trauma. So I stepped out, set up a cafe with my daughter, making keto cakes and bread. Which I actually love, so I still do that. As well as stepping back in a little bit into the trauma world.
Right. So can I start you at the beginning then? Because it feels like there's obviously you've got perspectives and views on lots of different elements of, the care system and therapy and how we work with children and residential and social work. It seems like there's lots of stuff you can speak with sort of genuine informed knowledge about,
yes,
and professional knowledge and personal knowledge. So can I ask you, if it's okay, what can you tell me about why this little 2.5-year-old Nancy ended up in the care system?
I certainly can. Yes, we, my brother and myself and 2 stepsisters lived in a family that was quite dominated by alcoholism and domestic violence. At the age of 2.5, Dad's aggression, apparently accidentally, but in my head that really don't matter, took Mum's life. So we ended up at that point with a period of about 5 years. The elder 2 sisters were taken in by family on my mum's side, and we had the extreme luxury of staying with Dad, which then also meant family didn't want to know us because Dad came along with that. So up until about 7, we were in and out of care, left with neighbours a lot of the time, looking after ourselves. And then when I think I was 7, it was decided enough was enough, and then we were placed in care full time.
There's enough. There's so much stuff in there already. By the time you're 7, what a complicated little, worldview you must have had as a child, and who you were and where you fitted in. That must have I mean, can you remember that sort of being in and out? Is it, what was your sort of views on foster care and that?
I am writing at the minute. And one of the terms that I use, because it's what it felt like, was that we went through periods of time of borrowing families. And that it was never really, even when I was older and I was in a long-term placement for about 7 years, it never ever felt like my family. It always felt like a space that I was borrowing until my next move. And I was a good kid. So I was a conformist. My survival strategies were watch what people want and then give them it. And that's the best way of remaining safe. My brother, on the other hand, was a rebel. Right. So his survival strategies were fight the world and everybody in it, which resulted in us eventually being separated.
I mean, all of that sounds incredibly complicated, and we're really, I mean, can I ask you what sort of time this was at? What period of time was this foster care experience?
So I was born in 1967, so it was early 70s when Mum died. So it was from kind of early 70s that we were in and out. We had three. We were shipped off to a convent when Mum first died, while Dad was arrested, and then placed back with him because there wasn't enough evidence. And then I remember quite vividly 2 short-term foster placements, one of them which was actually more threatening and abusive than being at home, and the second one that was actually quite nice. Both before the time that I was 4.5. Then a bit of drifting in between, and then the long-term placement when I was just before I was 7, I do believe it was.
I mean, I guess that's a time when foster care had very loose regulation, and anyone with a spare room and a big heart could foster, I guess. I would say inverted commas.
In later years, it gets better, my story. In later years, I managed to access some of my files from that period before we were accommodated full time, because the files from when I was accommodated full time were actually burnt to make space, which is a story in itself. So I have nothing about my life from 7 up other than what's in my brother's files from when he was placed in a different authority. But one of the things that's in the early files that I managed to get was the social worker had written that they'd been out to visit and Dad was on one of his absences. He used to go missing for a few days. We were left on our own. And they took us round to a neighbour's and asked the neighbour if we could stay there. And the neighbour said yes. And so they'd said, can you also enrol them in school? And the neighbour had said yes. And then the next sentence says, case closed.
Yeah,
which is, it's kind of like, so then it's, when I've read back on it, the big thing for me was like, so we just didn't matter to anybody then.
Yeah.
Not just that we didn't matter to Dad.
Yeah, and I mean, because I wasn't sure what time period, and if you'd said, that was the 40s or the 50s, I'd have gone, right, I'm not too surprised by that, but we're talking about the 70s.
Yes, early 70s. Yeah.
And you'd have thought that the world would have, wouldn't be in that place by then.
No.
Is it not hard to look back at that and be, have really strong feelings about that?
Although I like to think I'm in my early 20s, I'm in my mid-50s now. So I've had a lot of time to work on it and process it. And I always knew, when I was doing my training to do therapy, I always knew I wanted to have a voice that could speak about what we went through as children. And also speak about lessons that need to be learned. And many lessons there's many things that are very different to what they were when we were kids, but it never ceases to amaze me the times when I come across experiences 50 odd years on, where I think, but that happened with us. Why is it still happening now?
Yeah.
And I think, go on, sorry.
No, you go on, because it's your podcast.
I think a big part of that is, I love theory. I love reading all the theories behind attachment and trauma and dissociation. And we mentioned earlier Bruce Perry. He was one of my early gurus when I was training. And we have this wealth of information, but sometimes I think we still don't get the basics. Mm-hmm. We still, if I look back on the little bit of information that I've got in my files, I must have had probably 8 or 10 social workers from the time when I was placed full term, and nobody, not one of them, knew me. And the entries that are in my files describe the compliant, well-behaved, intelligent little girl that I was, but nobody knew me. Mm-hmm. And nobody actually knew what was happening in my life, because I'd learned by that time you don't tell them. And then when I kind of transport myself now, and I don't mean this in any disrespect, but I've had run-ins with social workers when I'm working therapeutically, where social workers have said to me, but I've known this kid for 4 years, how can you possibly know that? Because they've never told me that, or they've never said that to me. And I'm like, but why would they?
Yeah.
It's not kids that come from trauma don't openly sit and tell you the trauma. So it's kind of thing, but that's one of my big things that I think very often we still place children on face value.
Yeah.
And we place the performer part, and then adopters and foster carers are then left with this huge difference from what they thought was being placed to what is.
Yeah.
With a lot of professionals who've known the child for a long period of time, not accepting what they're actually seeing and experiencing. And that for me is a big issue, because I wasn't the child that people saw in me wasn't the child that I was. It was the child that I'd learned to be in order to gain some kind of safety in life.
Almost like an avatar of what that child's protective personality would be. That
yes,
you're talking about what you needed to do to be safe. That became this false personality.
Yes, yeah. So this in the book that I'm writing at the minute, I marry it up with poems, and one of the poems in there is about going to another family that you're borrowing and unpacking, and a part of it is sort of, where do I unpack me? So this space for my shoes, this space for my coat, this space for my belongings, but where do I unpack me? And I think that's a big message, I think, that I would like to get across, that is very often the actual child is missed.
Yeah.
And
that
and
takes
we need
time,
to be more
doesn't
aware.
it?
Yeah.
And training as well, and
yes.
everyone needs to bring their A game to that.
Yeah. And I think you're right in that with training. I think there's more in-depth training needs to be given to social workers, to teachers, to anybody. We have a lot of traumatized children in this world. A lot of people who are given the task of caring for them and nurturing them and guiding them without the level of training that personally I think they need. I think there's a lot of theory out there. Sometimes I think there's a gap of translating the theory into what it actually feels to live that. If that makes sense.
No, that makes total sense, but it feels... I don't feel particularly optimistic. Is that...
No, well, I intend dying optimistic.
Well, I mean, naturally, I am optimistic, but I just think when you're given, especially around social work, I suppose I'm thinking through that lens that, you know, the number of the turnover of staff and the high caseloads, just they're all just barriers to spending time with a child, which because there's got to be an element of taking time.
Absolutely, and I absolutely agree with you. Sorry,
no,
on that one.
You talked about this sort of the separation between you and your brother, and
Yes.
and you were sort of talking about how the things you see now that reflect what your experience. And can you tell me, you know, again, I feel like I'm asking really personal questions. This isn't therapy, so you can tell me to bog off.
No, it's fine.
You know, that relationship, was it close before you were separated from him, and did it, you know, what was the impact of that on the relationship, and what was it like beforehand?
My there's about 11 months between us.
Right.
And for a lot of time, all I remember is me and him. And I remember him being a warrior and me being a crier. So sticky situations, he was very often the one that would be this big, brave, well, not big because we were very little, but he would be the one that would like take me hand and lead me to wherever we needed to be. He would also be the one that would take me hand and lead me into trouble. But we were kind of like allies. And I think that was the reason why we were separated in the end, because of his need to fight in order to survive. And we'd got to a place where in fact, I remember the day we were separated, actually. We were both placed together in a long-term placement. And they decided they couldn't cope with him anymore, which I completely understand because he was an out-and-out rebel. But I was actually taken. I would have been probably about 8 because he didn't last very long in that placement, and sat down in a room with a guy who I'd never met in my life, and told that they were thinking of moving him, and asked really what I thought of it and if it should happen. And I can remember it vividly. Yes, I know. I can remember it vividly because I can just remember looking at this man and thinking that it was odd that I got a say, because even at that age, I was kind of like, does what I'm going to say matter?
Yeah.
And then also just thinking, that I didn't want to move anymore.
Right.
And that was my big thought in that moment. So I can remember just shrugging it and then just saying, yeah. And that'd be the end of it. And then being brought out, put in the car, crying and being told to stop crying. And then that was it. It was gone. And I think the relationship probably stayed, but just took a different path.
Right. And did you remain in sort of contact with one another?
Yes. Yeah, we had contact. The foster carer I was with would facilitate it. Sometimes we'd go into the town and meet up with him. Sometimes the social worker would take me to whichever placement he was in, and we would have contact there. And funnily enough, around the age of like 12, 13, our roles reversed, and I kind of became the mature, caring one in the relationship. So, and we still have quite a good relationship to this day.
It just seems, it's easy to spout off what we know about sibling relationships, isn't it? We've got this really clear narrative, and there's no one even questioning that. But it just seems like that doesn't change the sort of the bureaucratic need sometimes, just to actually this isn't working and the foster carer can't do it, which I get. I get two children with complicated needs. Clearly experienced a lot of adversity, but even it seems nonsensical to sort of sit you down and say, what do you think? Because if they'd done what you wanted, would that not have been your fault forever if you'd said yes or no?
I did carry that burden for a lot of years. I did, because he went on to some quite abusive placements. So a big bit about what I had to work through later as an adult was I responsible for sending him there? If I'd have said no, as that child in that room, if I'd have said no, I don't want him to go, he can't go, would he then have not had those placements that he had? But in reality, it would have probably have been, we would have both gone to those placements. But I suppose at that time, that was the bit that I was working through. And we both came from experiences where we had massive amounts of shame, and if bad things happen, they happen because of us. So I suppose it just tied into that. But yes, it's a bizarre thing to be sat and ask that question. Sorry, I hope I just coughed down your microphone then.
No, that's absolutely fine. It's not a problem. I've got this idea then of you sort of going through the system but being a very, a child with a lot going on inside, like all children. And so you talk about you've gone on to work in the sector, and as you were coming to leaving school, was it a clear decision? This is where I want to work. I want to work with children and young people, or how did that come about?
Initially, I wanted to be an hairdresser when I was about 14, 15, which was bizarre because my hair was like something from the is it the Air Bear bunch?
Yeah.
I wasn't known for having good hair. Then I kind of went like 15, 16 thinking I'd like to be a nanny or a school teacher. And then my last placement I had was linked with quite a staunch religion, which I'll tell you this little bit because it's quite relevant to that. So I spent all my childhood knowing cognitively that Mum was dead, but not believing that she was. And with this really, really huge hope that she was going to come back and claim me one day.
Yeah.
Until I was 14, didn't know her name. Until 2 years ago, didn't have a photo, so didn't know her face, because nobody spoke about her. So at 14 was placed temporarily in this home, who the religion taught that when Armageddon comes, if anybody died in ignorance of their God, they would be resurrected onto the earth, and those of that religion who survived Armageddon would live with them.
Right.
So kind of at 14, I was given this hope that not only would I know what my mum looked like, but I'd actually get to live a life with her. So I stayed there and joined that religion.
Right.
Because that then became a really, really big hope. So at that time, anything that I thought I was going to do career-wise went out of the window because what I was going to do was knock on doors and preach so that I could get through Armageddon to live with my mum. So, and my thoughts of doing anything then didn't come back until I'd married and I'd had 3 children within that religion, and then left the religion, and then started thinking again about what I wanted to actually do with life.
I mean, that was a very short sentence, but there's an awful lot in there. And it kind of reflecting the sort of the vulnerability of young people, especially young people who've experienced adversity, and the kind of the peculiar logic loops that they find themselves in. I mean, looking back now, that it's easy to look back with 2020, but looking back now, was there anyone who could have guided you a different way, or helped you? Where were did you have a social worker who was, because by the time you're in the 80s, you're a teenager. We're not that far away from where we are now, then, are we? All of a sudden,
I had a social worker at that time. Well, I think I had, with about a year, I think I had about 3 different social workers. And I remember a young lady I really liked her, was my social worker. She was the one who actually met me on a street corner and handed me a load of paperwork that told me my mum's name and, oh, by the way, did you know your dad killed her?
Hang on, whoa, let's just pause a second there. I don't want to make light of it, but blimey, Nancy. So no one had told you that you knew your mum had passed away, but no one had kind of made any sense of how that had happened. So what had you thought had happened to her?
I knew that she'd had a fall down the stairs.
Right.
That was, for some reason, indelibly imprinted in my head. I remember at the time, at 2.5, I remember vividly walking in through the door from the bottom of the stairs and collapsing. And then I was never seen her again. So I think because we had regular contact with Dad. Well, I say regular, there were sometimes when he would disappear and we wouldn't see him, but then he would come back on the scene. And he would never tell us anything. He wouldn't even speak her name. So I just thought that she'd had a fall. She was heavily pregnant at the time. So I thought she'd lost her balance and fallen down the stairs because of being heavily pregnant. I didn't know that Dad had been involved in it and that he'd been arrested for it until that street corner when I was 14. Which was a bit of a shock, to say the least.
But yeah, I mean, did the social worker know that you didn't know? I'm just thinking that that's just not the place. There's no good place to do it, but that's not the place to do it.
I do believe that she knew I didn't know because she knew that I knew nothing.
Right.
So she'd gone on a search to find me early files from before we'd moved into that area, before we were accommodated full time. And she wouldn't have done it with any ill intent, I know that. But it was just, when I look back now, I just think, and I think this is one of my big things that I carry, that I try to put across, is the early messages with our relationship with Dad and with the extended family, although I understand why nobody took us in. The early messages were we didn't matter. and we were nothing. And then when I look back over my experience in the care system, that message was quite often repeatedly stamped as true. And that's one of the things that I'm really big on trying to get acknowledged and changed, is that sometimes this system can be as abusive as, in a different way, as the early abusive experience. And I looking back at that time now, I think, had that been her niece or her sister or possibly even a next door neighbour, would she have given them that news in the way I got it?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, and it's a simple answer, isn't it? It's just a plain old no. And so it does ask those questions about what a corporate parent means, that no one gets to take responsibility of that. You know, there's no... I had a friend who was a virtual school head, and she said she realised that, and she said, I try and act like every child is my child.
Yes.
And that just puts a slightly different slant on everything, doesn't it? As you say, it's down to how you even share information, how you talk to a child, and that. Yeah. Wow. So
I told you we'd be here till early hours at morning.
Yeah, I think there might need to be a part 2, 3, 4, and 5 at this rate. So you've travelled through the care system. You've kind of become involved in this specific sort of faith community. Were you in the community? Mm-hmm. So what then? So you sort of very briefly you described that sounds like it was quite quick. It was you're married, 3 children, and then so what was? I feel like I'm prying. I am prying. But you said you'd come on the podcast. If I can't ask it, you'll tell me.
Feel free to pry. Feel free to pry.
Yeah, you'll dodge it if you need to dodge it. So, I mean, all the time, was there a consciousness that your life experience had kind of given you a different worldview, and you saw the world differently, or you felt differently about the world?
I think I always knew from quite a young age that I wanted to make a difference in some way. I never, as a teenager, I never knew how, but I suppose that's why I probably started thinking I wanted to be a teacher or a nanny, or that I wanted to do something that made a difference. But it wasn't until I was a young mum, and then thinking about, actually, I want to make a life here. That then I started, like I say, first of all, thought about social work, and then moved into the more therapeutic side of care. So it would probably sound really bizarre and really corny, but I remember when I was training thinking, I always knew I'd got a message that I wanted to give, but I just didn't know how to give it.
So had you left school with sort of good qualifications? Were you in a position to sort of start to retrain even? I mean, you describe yourself as a young married mum, or a mum of 3. How do you even start? Where do you start?
I left school when I was 16, and my English teacher had really big dreams for me. He really wanted me to go on to university. At that time, I was in the religion with the belief that doesn't matter because Armageddon's coming.
Yeah.
And I can remember him sitting me down once, and I didn't put the time into the revision, and he was really disappointed with me results in the English literature exam, and sat me down and said, I really want you to stay on. I think you can do really well. And I was like, well, I can't, because I've got to pioneer and I've got to go knocking on doors. And he sat and he says to me, look, I'll make you a timetable that says that you can go and do all that you feel you need to do, but you also come and do an education, because otherwise you're wasting your brain. So you've got the potential to go and achieve something. And I didn't. I just walked away from it all. So I got minimal qualifications when I left. And then set up as a young mum when I left the dad, and decided, actually, I want to do something, and started off in a bakery and as a cleaner in an old people's home, while I went back to college to get some qualifications that meant I could go in a room and mess with people's heads.
Well, I mean, it seems like, I mean, you're just sort of demonstrating amazing resilience, really, because, you know, as a young mum of three, as a solo parent of three, to go to college and work, I'm kind of thinking, who are the, you know, how do you manage that? You know, we often hear about the care leavers being really isolated in the community, and not having those families to fall back on. Was there any part of your family that you could fall back on, or who were the people who were around you? Was there anyone?
There were a lovely couple, an older couple, who'd been part of the religion, who, when I left the religion, that had been kind of the whole life. You didn't make friends outside of it.
Yeah.
So when I made the decision to leave my husband, that wasn't allowed. So then I was kind of cast out. So I didn't have a group of friends, because all of my friends were in the religion, but there was this one older couple that were really lovely and decided that they wouldn't turn to stone if they spoke to me. So kind of Kate stayed as a bit of a support. And then not the last foster family that I'd been in that were part of that religion, but the foster family before, I was still in touch with. And she was phenomenal as a support. So, yeah. That was kind of it. And of course, the kid's dad was still involved in the life. So I also had that.
It seems like a quite, you know, as a young woman in her 20s, sounds like you had a lot going on.
Yes.
That's understating it somewhat. So
just a bit. And probably that was probably the time when I got a bit lost.
Right.
I was very good as a child. Everything you'd ever read about me in any of my reports was how good I was as a child. I was good as a teenager, as part of the religion. And then I kind of went out on my own in my kind of mid-20s. And I've just realised I've just stopped myself there because I was going to swear, and I've just realised I can't. So
you can swear on the podcast. It's absolutely fine.
And I kind of found myself in this position of thinking, I'm going to say fluff instead of the word fluff. I don't know how to be. And here I am, responsible for 3 little lives. And actually, I don't know what my life is. And I don't know who I am outside of being a mother. So they were probably a few crazy years, a few silly and inappropriate relationships, and a bit of madness.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that was probably when all my rebellious behaviours and stupid decisions were made at that point. But we're still here.
Well, yeah. I'm just conscious that we're only in your 20s, and there's so much. I feel like I'm glad you're writing a book, because it feels like there's an awful lot of there's so many steps to get to where you are now, isn't there? And we're constrained by just the length of the conversation, but So can you then move me on to then you've started to get involved with you've been through what sounds like a total normal and appropriate reaction to kind of all of that other stuff. You've had those mad moments. You've moved on to kind of starting to turn the ship around, and you start to become involved in working with people. And then there's a difference between working with people and then kind of moving into being a therapist. So how did that come about? How did you make those decisions, and where were you aiming for?
I initially went back just to get a taste of studying again and seeing whether I could actually do it. So I went back and did psychology and sociology as kind of a pathway into, like I say, what I thought I was going to do, which was social work. So I got those qualifications and then started the application to do my DIPSWA. And pre that, you had to go in and have experience somewhere.
Sorry, what's your DIPSWA, just for people who don't know?
Oh, sorry, for the diploma in social work. I don't know what the full thing stands for.
That'll do.
At that time. It's probably different now, but at that time, many, many years ago, that's what it was. So I volunteered at Bernardo's for a little while, and then went into residential care as a job. And that, like I said, that's when I was like, no, social work's not for me. Yeah. So decided instead to go down getting qualifications for counselling. One of my big regrets in life is, it's not a regret. I'm quite happy with the path that I took. Sometimes it's a closed door for me because I haven't got the pieces of paper that say that I'm as clever as I am. Because right. I wanted to get the basic qualification to literally get in the room and on the carpet with the kids. Yeah. So I studied as much as I needed to study in order to get into doing that. So I had a few years in residential care, and then was picked up by a manager of the adoption team. She was the manager of the adoption part of it. So we're trying to set up a therapeutic unit, and I was within that unit, and asked me if I'd be the guinea pig as the key worker who was involved with the child and the therapist, which I very willingly said yes to. And the rest is history.
Well, I mean, it does feel like a really fortuitous conversation. But that must have been quite a moment when someone said, no, this is what we want you to do. We want you to be that person who you sort of think, I wish I'd had that person. Was it as simple as that?
I'd actually approached them while I was, I'd approached the team, this manager, for a placement while I was studying. Right. But I approached at the wrong time because Ofsted were around. So it didn't happen. That's why I went to Bernardo's. And then I ended up in this children's unit. And it did feel like gold. It felt like the opportunity of a lifetime. So she already knew of me, but couldn't take me on at that time. And then came back and was, oh, right, I know you. I've met you. Will you step into this role? And I was, yes, absolutely, I will. And it was hard. It was hard at times because I'd not done all of my own therapy. So,
well, I was conscious of that a key component of any sort of therapy, any therapist or people who work in that area is that they need to have their own stuff sort of kind of sorted away, don't they? And I thought that must have been quite difficult to then, to see your own experience reflected in the children that you're working with, and that must have caused some interesting days.
Going back to what I was saying about when me and my brother were separated, there was one case that I was involved with two sisters that had been placed, who the plan had come to light that they were going to separate them and they'd come back from a disrupted attachment where they'd been together. And then they were in with us for a while. Very, very different needs. And then it was decided they were going to be put in separate placements. And I can remember for months fighting against the decision and and I can remember being in a meeting and crying about how they couldn't separate these girls. And then it being months after when I just sat and thought, shit, but I was actually crying for me there.
Yeah.
I was trying to replay what happened for me there, because actually it was the best decision for these girls and should have happened earlier. But being very aware that actually I'd allowed some of my stuff as the professional in that setting to play out and take over, actually, the importance of what needed to happen for the children. And it was a massive, massive learning curve for me, because that was totally opposite to what I ever wanted to do. But it sneaked up on me and smacked me around the back of the head. And before I knew it, I was doing it. So
that, no, I mean, that's really honest, because I think that is the danger, isn't it? That people become, like you said, that they're fixing their own problems through the cases, and that is really. And I mean, did other people see that? I mean, did that put you in a vulnerable position, sort of from your registration?
No, I don't think anybody else really picked up on it, because people, I think, within the home were split as to whether they should be separated, whether they should stay together. So it wasn't like I wasn't a lone wolf and a lone voice in it. It was just afterwards when I was kind of sitting and thinking, why did I get so emotionally involved in that fight? Why did it feel so personal to me? And it felt personal to me because it had become personal to me. That on some level I'd started to try to redress something that had happened. My experience.
And so, I mean, in the midst of all that, then you described sort of having someone letting someone in to start to do that work with yourself. And was that a long I mean, it's probably a never-ending process, isn't it? But
Al, it's like you've read my story. The questions you're asking are really key questions for the best bits of my story.
Oh, I'm not giving away the good bits. There's no spoilers. Don't tell us how it ends.
No. And this bit I actually use on training when I'm doing the training. Well,
go on then. Give us a.
Let me tell you this little bit.
Yeah, go on.
So in training to do what I wanted to do, obviously you have to do your own work before you let loose on people. And I was into the third year before I would agree to go, because I was, I don't want to sit and open up my wounds and be vulnerable. Thank you very much. But in the end, I knew I had to do it in order to get the qualification at the end. So I went to see my first counsellor. You're going to love this. Who was a lovely, lovely woman. And I kind of sat, and in the first 5 minutes, gave her a quick rundown of probably the first 7 years of my life. And then looked across at her, and she was sat crying. Which kind of stopped me short. And then she.
I was going to say, so it's like these Russian dolls, isn't it? It's like now she needs to go away and talk about her own boundaries and her own.
Yeah. So it gets better. It gets better, because then she kind of gathered herself and took a deep breath and said, "Well, at least you're not a drug addict or a prostitute." At which point I kind of sat and thought, well, I haven't told you that I'm not. And is that where my story should have ended? Is that the assumption that that's where my beginning would take me? And it was a real kind of, okay then. So I came in feeling a bit messed up, and now I'm going out feeling even more messed up because apparently that is the view of, of what I was supposed to attain to.
Yeah, I mean, we're laughing, but it's not funny.
No, not in the least. Not in the least. Not in the least.
That is the very last thing you need to come out of after you've, especially you've described like this, like, right, well, I'm going to have to do it, and so it needs to, and it needs to be good and safe, and that isn't what it was.
No. So I didn't stay with that.
I see how that works. Yeah, that's fair. So you broke the first counsellor, got them deregistered.
No, I didn't. I just decided not to go back. I think in all seriousness, I think I just came away thinking, shit, my stuff's too heavy to hold. So I need to not tell it.
Which is awful.
So the next time that I went in, I kind of tapered it back a bit. I was kind of like, okay, I won't give the full stuff. I'll do what I need to do to get through the process. For them to say, oh yeah, she's done her work, she's all right. which is
it's a different sort of bad, isn't it? It's yeah.
But that's that's kind of digressing slightly. You did say I could just talk.
Yeah.
One of the reasons why I write is because it's talking without being interrupted.
Right.
And I do love to talk.
I can not interrupt you if you want. I can just let you go. I'll just.
No, it's fine. No.
I'll go off and have my tea.
You see, now you've wounded me.
Have I? Well, got to use these social work skills, haven't I?
So yeah, the other thing, just on that I kind of learned through life, that's very difficult, and probably people who come from a similar background will relate to this, is I would very often find myself in social situations because my life to me was normal. That was my life. It might not have been great, but it was my life. So I'd find myself in social situations where people were talking about childhood and talking about like different little stories and anecdotes that they would say, and I'd join in, and the room would go silent. And then after a while, I was like, oh, it's one of those conversations. Oh, this is where I just listen. I can remember telling somebody at work once a story about one of the homes, the placements that I was in. My bedroom was up in the loft, not done out like we know lofts to be done out.
Yeah.
And on a night time, I went up the little ladder with my bucket to pee in and the tray to put on the top of it. And the ladder was taken down, and the thing was shut until the next morning. And I just kind of described it like that. That wasn't the story I was telling her. That was the build-up to it, because I was telling her something else. But I'd got to that point and looked at her, and she was stood with her mouth open and tears in her eyes. And again, it was one of them moments of, oh, shit. Right, okay, that's too much as well. But to me, it was just part of what it was.
It was like the preamble before you got to the whatever you were going to say. It was just normal.
It was kind of like setting the scene, and then that was it. We didn't do the rest of the story because the scene setting was a bit too much in itself, and that's really difficult. That's one of the. I think that's probably one of the things I find the most difficult, coming from where I've come from, is that there's a lot of norm, and I still find it difficult to this day. I'll quite often be in social situations where I'll take myself away and I might have a bit of a cry, especially if I've had a couple of gin and tonics, because I really want to join in, and I know I can't.
It's odd because I'm thinking, this isn't therapy, but I just it seems like you're dislocated from the world, and is the temptation then to bring out the avatar, the palatable version of you, and your stories, which is replicating this little girl who, I'll tell you what you need to hear.
Yeah, I don't think I can filter it anymore. I just don't say it. Every now and again I slip, and a story will come out. And sometimes it's okay, but other times it still has it kind of ends the conversation in the room. But it's difficult. I think that's probably the most difficult aspect for me, that still hangs with me from my experience. I think the rest of it I've dealt with and put to bed. But that's the bit that still stays with me sometimes. So thank you for giving me a platform where I can talk about it.
Oh, I mean, it's such an insight into your experience and likely comparable to other people's experiences. How do your family, I mean, you've got children.
Yeah.
How do your family how do they make sense of that? Do they know? Do they, what's their view on your life and experiences?
As adults now, I do believe, well, I know because they tell me that they're extremely proud of who I've become and who I am. As children, obviously, they suffered the consequences of my maladapted way of being an adult, coming from a difficult childhood. So they were never harmed in any way, but on an emotional level, I was probably more messed up than what they could have done with a mum. And I'm not going to go particularly deep on that because there's bits that they don't know about where life took me at that point. But I think one of the big things was, and again, something that a lot of probably girls and maybe some boys will relate to is from probably the age of 8 or 9, my focus was on being old enough to have my own children because I had this big belief that would fill this huge gap, this chasm that I felt inside. That if I just had my children and my family, then that would be it. Everything would be okay. And what actually happened was when I had my first daughter, was it just ripped open the wounds completely. And then the whole trauma of losing mum and growing up without her and the loss and the grieving for that loss that I never did as a child just came flooding in. And my children were all quite close together. There's 2 years between them. So that kind of rawness of them becoming a mum and losing that dream that had kept me going for years, that this would just make life okay. And actually life became a bit unbearable. Meant that I then wasn't the mum that I'd always dreamt that I would be.
Sorry.
I think I was okay.
Yeah.
And they're all lovely adults now with families of their own and lives of their own. But there were some tough years and difficult relationships.
Just it sort of dispels the myth that, I heard it today. I can't remember where I was, but I heard someone saying, "Oh, children are resilient." I was on the news. Someone was saying, "Oh, children are resilient." And I was thinking, no, they're not. They just keep breathing. They keep going. And that the impact of that adversity, both, in your family, both in the system, that it casts a shadow that touches everything.
Yeah.
And it sounds like you've brought a lot of sunshine and you've got, but the shadows, you know, they're not gone, are they? Is that, they're not, if you look hard enough, it seems like they're still there.
Yeah. It's I'm not doing this as a Michael Parkinson, I'm going to sell my book thing. But it's relevant to what you're saying. The first title that I thought of for it was When Trauma Haunts You. Because I think that is very true. It's not going to be that now. But that is very true, that it's kind of, I've done masses and masses of work, and I can now talk about my story quite openly, and I'm okay with it. I can even have a giggle about it, and which was where I wanted to be. But there's always that little bit in the background that I don't think you ever fully resolve trauma. I think there's always something in life that can just bump against that wound that just makes you feel it again. The therapy that I've had stops it overtaking my life, but it doesn't stop the soreness sometimes if I get a bump on that old wound, which is the bit that I think is the haunting bit.
Yeah. I mean, that's really well articulated. And I'm conscious that we've spent, as you said, when there's so much to talk about, and you know, we're sort of slightly constrained by format, but could you tell me a little bit about what you do now, and you know what do you do now? Okay.
I make lovely pizza bases that are really low carb and sugar free.
Excellent.
I've for a lot of years, I did the therapy side, had a step out of it, but never stepped away from the training. I have a massive, massive passion for training. And I'm very proud of the training that I do a 6-week, it's called a therapeutic parenting course, but I really struggle with that because I don't think it has therapeutic parenting, an essence of that to it, but it's more about understanding what happens to the autonomic nervous system of a child in trauma, and understanding that doesn't just reset itself once you bring them out of the trauma. And I think that's very often missed when we look at reparenting children. And if we don't reset that, it don't matter how many strategies you've got, they're not going to be consistent. So that's my big passion is in training and talking about not just the care system, but mental health in itself. I think sometimes we live in a culture where we say, oh, yeah, mental health, yeah, it's a big issue, isn't it? Let's look at what it's like when it's better. And we kind of go from, we acknowledge it to, yeah, but let's look at how it's healed. And we don't sit with the people in the horribleness of it. My feeling is that we're kind of like, oh, yeah, it's horrible. Let's just brush that to one side and let's think about, it's done now. How can you have a nice life? And within that, and it's the same with our kids. I say our kids, you know what I mean, don't you?
Yeah.
Is that there's a period in that healing process where the fact that you sat in that shit and were covered by that shit needs to be validated before you get to the healing bit and the let's move to the nice stuff. And we don't like to hear it. Part of what I've been telling you here is that I know that people don't like to hear it. But I can't make my life not be what my life was. And it doesn't mean that because my life doesn't fit into a niceness and a normalness, it doesn't mean that my life wasn't valid and that my experience wasn't valid. I'm rambling now, aren't I?
No, I think everything informs everything, doesn't it? And so where can people, you've got a website. What is your website?
NM Trauma Recovery.
We'll put a link in the notes as well, so don't worry if people don't get it.
I'm not very technologically gifted. So what I do say to people is, yes, I've got a website, but if you want to know anything, contact me.
Right. And do you have a Facebook page, or do you have
I do. Yes, right. I've got a Facebook page that, again, is NM Trauma Recovery, and that's where I tend to put more on. Right. I tend to have more engagement with that. Excellent. Because there's more connection with people. Websites don't connect with people, and I'm a people person.
Yeah. Well, what I'd love to do is, you've been so generous with your time and your story. What I'd love to do, though, is to find out more about your training. And so maybe could we get you back on the podcast in the future and talk about some of the stuff around, the trauma recovery and, the work that you do and, the work that you've done, but also your training and, and shine a light on that sort of, that perspective and that model of supporting children.
Oh, would I like to come and talk again? Let me think.
Difficult question. Don't answer too quickly.
Oh, why not?
Why the heck not? Well, Nancy, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate you chatting to me. And again, as I said, so generous with your time and your story, and so open. So look after yourself, and we'll speak to you soon.
Thank you for having me.
Recording stopped.